Here we go. Okay, we are reading day 8, book 8, The Color of Law. The Color of Law. We're on chapter 8. I'm gonna ask that if you're watching this live or if you're watching this back, just go ahead and share this live, as I am doing right now. We're gonna get started here in 1 second. We had to move sets, prepare for a little rain. We're in a decent spot now, so we are on chapter 8, Local Tactics. The Color of Law, page 132. In southern and border states, and in some northern cities where explicit school segregation was practiced before the Supreme Court 1954 Brown decision, authorities developed another tactic to impose residential segregation where it not otherwise exists, placing the only schools that served African American children in designated African American neighborhoods and providing no transportation for black students who lived elsewhere. African American families who wanted their children to be educated had no choice but to find housing in the newly segregated areas. Hello. How you doing? You still awake?
Yeah.
What was the lawsuit here in Rockford? It was the people who cares. People who cares versus Rockford Public Schools. Okay, this little section, this little paragraph made me think of, and it was before my time, so I'm not that well versed in it as I probably should be or want to be, but it did make me think of the limited knowledge that I have on that so far, and it made me want to go back and read more into that, and if I can get my hands on any legal documents or things like that. That's what this initial little paragraph made me think of. Again, day 8, book 8, chapter 8. I don't like that I said that. When in 1928, Austin, Texas, adopted its master plan that proposed a single African American neighborhood on the east side, the document explicitly lamented the Buchanan ruling. It noted that there has been considerable talk in Austin, as well as other cities, in regard to the race segregation problem. This problem cannot be solved legally under any zoning laws known to us at present. Practically all attempts as such have proven unconstitutional. Unable to legislate explicit segregation, the master plan proposed creating an incentive to draw the black population to this east side area. The incentive was to relocate segregated schools and other public services for African Americans to Austin's east side. These actions were effective, and soon almost all African Americans in Austin had moved east. For example, in 1930, the integrated neighborhood of Wheatsville had an African American population of 16%. In 1932, its segregated school for African American pupils was shut down, and by 1950, the community's African American population was 1%. The city closed other schools and parks for African Americans outside the east side area, and had been designated for the residents. Additional inducements for African Americans to consolidate were created by the construction on the east side of a new segregated library, a new park, and an improved segregated high school. Then, in 1938, the segregation of the African American population in the area was further reinforced when the Planning Commission chose it as the location for Rosewood Courts, the all-black public housing project that had been won for Austin by Congressman Lyndon Johnson, while he also won a companion project for white people close to downtown. Once African Americans had been pushed into the east side, municipal services in the neighborhood declined. Streets, for example, were more likely to be unpaved than in other parts of the city. Sewers were poorly maintained and often clogged, and bus routes that served the east side were suspended during the summer because the same route served the University of Texas and were not needed for students when the university was on break. Zoning rules to preserve neighborhoods' residential characters were not enforced on the east side, leading to the establishment of industrial facilities in the area. Although the strategic placement of schools to designate racial zones was a tactic primarily available to southern cities with codified school segregation, the device was occasionally employed in the north as well. In the 1920s, Indianapolis used its school sitting policy to pursue the goal of residential segregation. The school board shifted the academically prestigious and all-white high school to an exclusive white community, far from the city's racial boundary. This left the former high school in an area near the border between the city's black and white neighborhoods, but the board refused to designate it for use by African Americans. Rather, it constructed a new high school for African American students near a glue factory and city dump, far from white areas. The case of Raleigh, and surrounding Wake County, North Carolina, is particularly noteworthy because in recent years, advocates of school integration have praised the county for its program of busing children to make its schools more diverse. Barred by the Supreme Court from explicitly integrating schools by race, the district, which includes the city of Raleigh, and its suburbs, has bused low-income children from the south and east sides of the county to middle-class neighborhoods in the mostly north and west. As it happens, children in the southeast side are mostly black, while those in the northwest side are mostly white. The segregated design that the busing was designed to overcome was no accident. It was created in part by racially motivated schools. It was created by racially motivated school sitting decisions in the early 20th century. Karen Benjamin, a historian at St. Xavier College in Chicago. I visited there. Has uncovered records that reveal how school placement decisions. Here we are. Let's start this over. Karen Benjamin, a historian at St. Xavier College in Chicago, has uncovered records that reveal how school placement decisions help force the segregation of Raleigh, as well of Houston and Atlanta. In Raleigh, in the early 20th century, neighborhoods of black and white concentration were scattered across the city. They included two relatively prosperous African American neighborhoods, Inglewood and College Park. In College Park, on what was then the city's northeast side. These middle-class communities of owner-occupied single-family home no longer exist because in the 1920s, the school board decided to transfer all schools for black students to the far southeastern section of the city, where planners hoped to isolate Raleigh's African Americans. Making matters worse, when the board provided Idlewild, Idlewild, and College Park's middle-class residents with a new school, it put the campus next to the city dump and a rock quarry filled with stagnant water. At the same time, it established the newest and most well-equipped schools for white students in far northwestern neighborhoods. In some cases, these areas were still largely undeveloped, where real estate interests hoped to attract white families. There was nothing hidden about the racial context. Of these school site decisions, and they generated considerable debate. An editorial in the moderate Raleigh Times said, "The black people making protests are of the best element of the race in Raleigh. Many of them live in the northeastern section, already occupied by a numerous growing population of black citizens, the majority of whom are owners of their own homes. They have built up with who knows what sacrifice a self-respecting and steadily improving community. It is a fact well known that the northeastern black section was due largely to the desire of better class black people to escape the very rock quarry locality in which it suggests the new school will take place." In Atlanta, the school board also helped to segregate a city that previously had some mixed-race housing. Before World War I, mostly black and white blocks were interspersed in central city neighborhoods. After the war, however, city planners determined that future city growth would be rigidly segregated, even though courts had struck down an explicit Atlanta racial zoning ordinance in 1924. The segregation maps guided school closure and construction decisions by the Atlanta School Board for the next 2 decades. Gradually, schools for white people were closed as if they were in zones designated for future African American residents, and schools for African Americans were closed if they were in zones reserved for white citizens. New schools for white students were built in the developing white suburbs, which forced white families to move to these communities if their children were to have access to the up-to-date schools. As with white families, black families who did not already live in their racially designated area were forced to find new housing if they wanted their children to attend a modern school. In 1919, when the policy was developing but still not fully formal, a school board converted the Ashby Street School on the west side in a planned ghetto area from a school for white people to one for African Americans. The minutes of a school board meeting report I don't know. Report the adoption of a motion that white families may be given 1 year to keep their children in the school, to allow the white residents of that section to sell their homes. It being understood that the school would be turned over to black people at the close of the year. Two high schools for white students in a racially mixed downtown area were closed and moved to the northern suburbs, while the city's first high school for black students was constructed far west of downtown in a still relatively undeveloped area, but one intended for African Americans. The Atlanta School Board commissioned a study by 2 Columbia University experts who recommended placing a new junior high school for white people in a densely populated neighborhood northwest of the central city area, where elementary school overcrowding was most severe. Because this area was racially mixed and designated for future African American residents, the board rejected the consultant's recommendation and instead constructed a new all-white junior high school across the railroad tracks in the far northern suburbs, forcing families to cease living in the integrated community if they wished their adolescent children to be educated. In Houston, in the 1920s, the City Planning Commission also drew up a map designating race restriction areas. Seeing that a Georgia court had rejected Atlanta's zoning ordinance, Houston never formally adopted the map. But as in Atlanta, the school board used it as a guide. At the beginning of the 20th century, many Houston neighborhoods were integrated. Substantial numbers of African American and white children lived in each of the city's 6 wards. Each ward had a school for African American children that was near, and in some cases on the same block as the schools for white people. Over 1/4 of African American children lived in a school. Over 1/4 of African American children lived in a school attendance district that was at least 70% white. The city plan, however, foresaw developing the west side of Houston for exclusive white residents, while pushing African Americans out the west side and into developing ghettos in the south and northeast. To accomplish this, in the 1920s and 30s, the school board built on the west side new schools with advanced facilities for white people. It set up on the far south side a modern high school for African Americans to induce middle class black families to move there. The city also established a Houston Black Hospital near the new high school as a further incentive for African Americans to relocate. The school board closed an elementary school for African American pupils on the west side and built better equipped schools for them in the working class neighborhoods of the northeast, while building relatively expensive schools for African Americans on the south side and northeast side. The school board appropriated little money for improvement at schools for African American pupils in the west. Similarly, white schools in the area designated for African Americans were closed or allowed to deteriorate. Each time the board made a decision about schools for African American pupils, a chief consideration was avoiding proximity to white districts. Professor Benjamin concludes that Professor Benjamin concludes that Houston's school building programs were the key to preserving school segregation long after the Brown decision declared it unconstitutional. Okay, Levittown. So I don't know. Again, I don't know how well you can see. These are white people. These are white people, a crowd of white people outside the home of the first African American family to move into an all-white development in Levittown, Pennsylvania. This is in 1957. I don't know how well you can see. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people. So we are on chapter 9. We're going to be on chapter 9. How many chapters are there? That's a good question. How many chapters are there? Color of Law. We are on chapter 9. There are 12 chapters. Oh, wow. So we are a little... about 60, 70, maybe 80 pages. 80 pages left of the book. Shorter book. The epilogue. How long is the epilogue? Yeah, about 80 pages left of the book. We're on page 139. This is chapter 9 of The Color of Law. State-sanctioned violence. In 1952, Wilbur Gary, a building contractor, was living with his family in one of Richmond, California's public housing projects. He was an African American Navy war veteran, a former shipyard worker, and vice commander of his American Legion post. The Gary family needed to find a new residence. Their apartment complex was slated for demolition because the Federal Lanham Act had required government projects for war workers to be temporary. A fellow Navy veteran, Lieutenant Commander Sidney Hogan, was moving out of Rollingwood, the suburb just outside Richmond, built during World War II. With the FHA requirement that the suburb be covered with restrictive covenants. 4 years earlier, though, the Supreme Court had ruled that covenants were not enforceable. So Hogan sold his property to Wilbur Gary and his wife. Nonetheless, the Rolling Stone Improvement Association, a homeowners group, insisted that its covenants gave it the right to evict African Americans. The NAACP came to the... Hold on, I wanted to bring this up. No, I've forgotten about it. I'm not going to... Maybe I'll read it for the group discussion, but I can't remember the exact year, but there was a protest outside of... I believe outside of West Middle School. No, maybe not. What's the one? Right there down. I can't remember. But anyway, it's here in Rockford. There's a middle school here in Rockford. I can't remember the street now. Okay. I'm thinking about there's a middle school. It's up the street from Boylan. It's damn, the only No. It's not. Is that Kennedy? No, not on Rockton. No, not on Rockton. Just right down. Oh, what's that street? When you're coming down Spring Creek, then you turn right, and it's just a straight shot to Boylan. It's like I can't.
Creek is nowhere near Boylan.
No. You after the roundabout, right? Yeah, Auburn. Yeah. When it turns into Auburn. So after the roundabout, you go down, and it's not. I don't think it's the first light. We take that right there, at one of the lights.
West. West Middle School.
I think it might be west. It's right down. What's that street
My
called?
high school, my first high school.
What's that street called?
Rockford.
No, it's not called Rockton. It's not called Rockton. No, it's not. It's not called Rockton. No, it is not.
West Middle School was on Rockford.
No, it's not. It's not on Rockton. No, it is not. Everything I know to describe it is like things that are personal to me.
Oh boy.
Like,
Why are we describing this anymore?
I was reading about the schools, and how they want to segregate schools and things like that. So I was thinking about how when I was looking up past cases of police shootings in the one database I was looking up things up in, that came up that there was a protest outside. I believe it was West Middle School.
I read that too.
You read that too? And there was however many students there, however many people outside the school, and
It was all about the distance they were from the school.
it was all about the distance. Hold on, we got this comment. What does this comment say?
West Middle School is on Rockford.
Oh no, but okay, maybe it's a different school then. Maybe it's a different school, because it's not what I'm thinking about.
I'm pretty sure I read that same article.
Oh
West
no.
High School at the time.
Okay. What was I thinking about?
Which did close at
Oh, okay.
1989.
I was thinking about Huffman. I was thinking about you turn.
Middle school.
Yeah. No, there is. Yes, there is. I used to go to the park and play basketball there. Yes, there is.
Alright, well, look into that.
Okay. There is a middle school on Huffman. I know there is. I passed it every day for 4 years. But anyway, this is unrelated. This was at West Middle School. They had this protest because a young woman wanted to be a cheerleader. And she was a woman of African descent. And she did everything. She was... I can't see the comments. I don't got my contacts in. Hold on. Give me 1 second. I'm going to check on my phone. But this young individual wanted to be a cheerleader. Right? This young individual wanted to be a cheerleader. And she was... No, not Welsh. I went to Welsh. No, I went to Welsh. Not Welsh. Not Welsh. I went to Welsh for preschool. For preschool, I went to Welsh. But anyway, I'll figure it out later. I'll figure it out later. This young black woman wanted to be a cheerleader, and she felt that she had all the qualifications of being a cheerleader. She was I really want to find this right now. Is it Westview? Oh, it's Westview. It's Westview Elementary. I knew I was right. Passed it every day. Westview. I was talking about Westview. But anyway, at West, there was a young African American woman who she wanted to be a cheerleader, and she had felt like she had that she had all the requirements, she had met all the qualifications of being a cheerleader, but she got denied. She got denied the right to be a cheerleader, or she got denied the opportunity to be a cheerleader. And there was not a huge protest, but it was a decently sized protest about it being her father and her parents were there, and a bunch of people were arrested. I think over like a dozen people were arrested because they believed it to be race related. They believed it to be she was the only black cheerleader there, or the only black individual that tried out to be cheerleader, and she was the only one that was denied. But I was right. It's Westview. It was right. Kennedy. No, Westview. It's Westview. It's Westview. I knew it. I think it's an elementary school though. In 1950. Oh no. Let's see. Let's pick up right here. Nonetheless, the Rollingwood Improvement Association, a homeowners group, insisted that its covenants gave it the right to evict African Americans. The NAACP came to the family's aid and dared the group to enforce the covenant. The neighbors then attempted to buy back the Gary house for nearly 15% more than the Garys had paid. They refused the offer. Soon after the Garys arrived, a mob of about 300 white people gathered outside their house, shouting epithets, hurling bricks, one crashed through the front window, and burning a cross on the lawn. For several days, police and county sheriff deputies refused to step in. So the NAACP found it necessary to organize its own guards. Sorry. Let's get back on track. A common. Let's start here. Let's start that sentence over. Oh no, that's a long sentence. We're gonna start the whole paragraph over. Soon after the Garys arrived, a mob of about 300 white people gathered outside their homes, shouting epithets, hurling bricks, one crashed through the front window, and burning a cross on the lawn. For several days, police and county sheriff deputies refused to step in. So the NAACP found it necessary to organize its own guards. A Communist Party affiliated civil rights group also provided help. The journalist Jessica Mitford, in her book A Final Conflict, described her participation in the group's efforts, which included escorting Mrs. Gary and the children to work and school, and patrolling nearby streets to alert the Garys to mobs that might be gathering. Meanwhile, the NAACP pressed California Governor Earl Warren, Attorney General Brown, and the local district attorney to step in. They eventually did so, ordering the city police and county sheriff to provide the family with protection. Still, the protests and harassment continued for another month, which continued with continued pleas from Wilbur Gary and civil rights groups for the police to intervene. No arrests, however, were made. The sheriff claimed that he did not have enough manpower to prevent the violence. Yet a single arrest is probably all that would have been required to persuade the mob to withdraw. I think with that, a lot of times it's same officers were part of those same rallies. The same county sheriffs were part of the same people that I wouldn't be surprised if it came out that it was a police officer or a county sheriff that was the one that threw the brick through their home. About the same time, the Levitt Company began to build its second large development. This one in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, a suburb of Philadelphia. Built post-Shelley, the Pennsylvania project did not have restrictive covenants. But the FHA continued to support Levitt and other developers only if they refused to sell to African Americans. Robert Mearday the African-American trucker who had delivered material to Levitt's Long Island project, won another contract with the company to deliver sheetrock to the Bucks County site. He settled his family in an African-American neighborhood in nearby Bristol. Excuse me. His son, Robert Jr., attended Bristol High School, graduating in 1955. He had a girlfriend there, Shirley Wilson, and he recalls that the Wilson family had attempted to move to Levittown, but was rebuffed by the Levitt Company, despite the negative publicity that the Wilsons' rejection had generated. I mentioned the flap, the term Robert Meredith Jr. uses in recalling the Wilson incident, because such instances were more commonplace than historians can document, and they must have had a profound effect on the awareness within the African American community of how their housing options were limited. It is remarkable that African American families continued to make the attempt to break into white suburban life, as they did in Levittown and Bucks County. By the late 1950s, white homeowners wanting to leave that development. By the late 1950s, white homeowners wanting to leave that development realized that it would be to their benefit, to sell to African Americans who, because they were so desperate for housing, would pay more than white people. So it happened that in 1957, an African American veteran, Bill Myers, and his wife, Daisy, filed a Levittown homeowner willing to sell. Oh, wow. Like many Levittown residents, Myers had served in World War II. He was discharged as a staff sergeant and held a steady job as a lab technician in the engineering department of a factory in nearby Trenton, New Jersey. Daisy Myers was a college graduate, and Bill Myers was taking courses towards a degree in electrical engineering. When no bank would provide a mortgage because the Myers family was black, and New York City philanthropists offered to give them a private mortgage, and Bill and Daisy Myers, with their 3 children, occupied their new home. That was crazy. How did that happen so quick? A few days later, the U.S. Post Office mail carrier, a federal government employee performing his official duties, noticed that he was delivering mail to an African American family. As he made his rounds, he shouted, he uses the N-word, had moved into Levittown. As many as 600 white demonstrators assembled in front of the house and pelted the family and his house with rocks. Some rented the unit next door to the Myers and set up a clubhouse from which the Confederate flag flew and music blared all night. Police arrived but were ineffective. I think that was not through these years, one of the things I've learned is that coincidences are rare. And it does not surprise me that the police showed up and were ineffective. Again, I wouldn't be surprised if the police showed up and they were the ones that threw rocks at the house. When Mr. Myers requested all-around-the-clock protection, the police chief told him that the department couldn't afford it. The town commissioners accused the state police of meddling because troopers were dispatched. Because troopers were dispatched when police failed to end the harassment. It was a needless worry. The state troopers also declined to perform their duty. Stop calling the police, man. For 2 months, law enforcement stood by as rocks were thrown. For 2 months, law enforcement stood by as rocks were thrown, crosses were burned, the Ku Klux Klan symbol was painted on the wall of the clubhouse next door. And the home of a family that had supported the Myers was vandalized. Some policemen assigned to protect the African American family stood with the mob, joking and encouraging its participants. Wow. One sergeant was demoted to patrolman because he objected to orders he had been given not to interfere. Okay. I thought this was the other way around. One sergeant was demoted to patrolman because he objected to orders he had been given not to interfere with the rioters. So he was given orders not to interfere, and he had a problem with that. He objected to that. And he was demoted. I would have been shocked. I would have been stunned. It might have been the most surprising thing that I had ever read if they found out that he had thrown rocks at the house when they demoted him. I would have been stunned. But no, it's because he had an objection to just standing by and letting these actions happen to this African American family. The district attorney approached Bill Myers and offered to purchase his property for a price substantially above what he had paid. Even though riot leaders were well known, for several weeks the police made no attempt to arrest them or shut down the clubhouse. The federal government did not discipline or reprimand the mail carrier. Eventually, the Pennsylvania Attorney General prosecuted some of the rioters for harassment and obtained an injunction against its continuation. But Bill and Daisy Myers, feeling constantly under threat, lasted only another 4 years. In 1961, they sold their Levittown home and returned to the African American neighborhood in York, Pennsylvania, where they had previously lived. Does the failure of police to protect the Gary and Myers family constitute government-sponsored said it for me one time. Not tweaking it up. De jure segregation. When police officers stood by without preventing the intimidation these families endured, were the African American families' constitutional rights violated, or were they victims of rogue police officers for whom the state was not responsible? Certainly, we cannot hold the government accountable for every act. I don't know how well I agree with this one. Certainly, we cannot hold the government accountable for every action of racially biased police officers. Yet, if these officers' superiors were aware of racial discriminatory activities conducted under color of law, as they surely were, and either encouraged these activities or took inadequate steps to restrain them, then these were no longer merely rogue actions, but expressed state policy that violated the 14th Amendment's guarantees of due process and equal protection. Excuse me. If we apply that standard to police behavior in Rollingwood and Levittown, we must conclude that law enforcement officers conspired to violate the civil rights of the Gary and Myers, and that this unremedied conspiracy of government authorities contributed to de jure segregation of the communities whose welfare they were responsible. What the Gary and Myers family experienced. Did I share this slide? I did share this slide. Okay. What the Gary and Myers family experienced was not an aberration. During much of the 20th century, police tolerance and promotion of cross-burning, vandalism, arson, and other violent acts to maintain residential segregation was systemic and nationwide. The attacks on African American pioneers, sanctioned by elected officials and law enforcement officers, could not have been attributable to white people's discomfort with a lower social class of neighbors. Wilbur and Maurice Gary and Bill and Daisy Myers were solidly middle class. Because more affluent communities were close to them, the African Americans who were victimized by such mob actions often had higher occupational and social status than the white neighbors who assaulted them. The circumstances belies the oft-repeated claim that resistance to integration has been based on fears of deteriorating neighborhood quality. Indeed, when African Americans did succeed in moving to previously white neighborhoods, they frequently were on their best behavior, giving no cause or pretext for a complaint, taking pains to make certain that their homes and lawns were better cared for than others on their block. Events in Chicago were only slightly more pervasive than elsewhere. Although most frequent in the post-World War II period, state-sanctioned violence to prevent integration began at the turn of the 20th century during the beginning of the Jim Crow era. In 1897, white property owners in Chicago's Woodland neighborhood declared war on African Americans, driving all African American families from the area with threats of violence, unimpeded by public authority. A decade later, in Hyde Park, adjacent to Woodlawn, the Hyde Park Improvement Protective Organization boycotts of more. Let me read this again. A decade later, in Hyde Park, adjacent to Woodlawn, the Hyde Park Improvement Protective Club organized boycotts of merchants who sold to African Americans and offered to buy out the homes of African Americans who lived in the area. If these tactics were unsuccessful, whites engaged in vandalism, throwing rocks through African Americans' windows. The leader of the club was a prominent attorney, and the club published a newsletter promoting segregation, so it would not have been difficult for authorities to interfere with the conspiracy, but no measures were undertaken. From 1917 to 1921, when the Chicago ghetto was first being rigidly defined, there were 58 fire bombings. Wow. From 1917 to 1921, when the Chicago ghetto was first being rigidly defined, there were 58 fire bombings of homes and white border areas to which African Americans had moved, with no arrests or prosecution, despite the deaths of 2 African American residents. In one case, explosives were lobbed at the home of Richard B. Harrison, a well-known black Shakespearean actor who had purchased a house in a white neighborhood. The bombs were thrown from a vacant and locked apartment in a building next door. The police did not make a serious attempt to find the perpetrator, failing even to question the building's occupants, although few possible conspirators could have had access to the apartment. Let me see. Hold on. Give me 1 second. Okay. The jury. Okay. Let's see. Right here. Nearly 30 of the 58 fire bombings were concentrated in a 6-month period in the spring of 1919. Wow. In 6 months, 30 fire bombings in the spring, leading up to one of the nation's worst race riots, set off when a white youth stoned an African American swimmer who had drifted towards a public beach area, generally understood to be for whites' use only. The swimmer drowned, and the policeman at the scene refused to arrest the attacker. Subsequent battles between white and black people left 38 people dead, 23 of whom were African American, and poisoned race relations in Chicago for years afterward. Interracial violence continued unabated. In the first 5 years after World War II, 357 reported incidents were directed against African Americans attempting to rent or buy in Chicago's racial border areas. From mid-1944 to mid-1946, there were 46 attacks on the homes of African Americans in white communities adjacent to Chicago's overcrowded black neighborhoods. Of these, 29 were arson bombings, resulting in at least 3 deaths. In the first 10 months of 1947 alone, 26 arson bombings occurred without a single arrest. In 1951, Harvey Clark, an African-American Chicago bus driver and Air Force veteran, rented an apartment in all-white Cicero, a Chicago suburb. Is it Cicero? I think it's Cicero. At first, the police forcefully attempted to prevent him and his wife, Janetta, and 2 small children from occupying the apartment. Some water, thank you. Westview.
Westview?
Yeah, Westview. On
We've
Huffman.
got middle schools in Rockford and Huffman.
I think it's a elementary school.
Grade school.
Yeah, but that's up this. That's up. That's a lot up. It's Westview.
Look up Westview.
Look up Westview. It's Westview. I promise you. I passed Westview for 4 years, Monday through Friday.
Just read.
Okay. I am. I'm sorry. Let's see. And okay. They threatened him with arrest, and worse, if the families did not depart. They threatened him with arrest, and worse, if the family did not depart. Get out of Cicero, the police chief told the real estate agent who rented the building, adding, don't come back, or you'll get a bullet through you. When Harvey Clark got a court injunction ordering the police to cease interfering with his occupancy and to afford him full protection from any attempt to restrain him, the police ignored it, making no effort, for example, to impede a group of teenagers who were pelting the apartment's windows with stones. When the Clarks refused to leave, a mob of about 4,000 rioted, raiding the apartment, destroying the fixtures, and throwing the family's belongings out the window onto the lawn where they were set ablaze. The officers present arrested no one. Time magazine reported that the police acted like ushers, politely handling the overflow at a football stadium. Similarly to what we saw at the Capitol, at the insurrection at the Capitol, where officers removed gates so the crowd could storm the Capitol. Governor Adlai Stevenson mobilized the National Guard to restore order. Although 118 rioters were arrested, a Cook County grand jury did not indict a single one. The grand jury, however, did indict Harvey Clark, his real estate agent, his NAACP attorney, and the white landlady who rented the apartment to him. Hold on. The grand jury, however, did indict Harvey Clark, his real estate agent, his NAACP attorney, and the white landlady who rented the apartment to him, as well as her attorney, on charges of inciting a riot and conspiring to lower property values. Incited, how you doing? They're the alleged offense at the time that he has sent that Harvey Clark and the people that were involved in him renting this apartment, that just by being an African American family in Chicago, and not in Chicago, being an African American family in Cicero, that was enough to incite a riot, just by being African American in the city, living in the city. Okay. 36 years later, when an African American family attempted to live in Cicero, it was met with firebombs and rifle shots. Nobody was convicted of these attacks either. Cicero's council president boasted after the clash that the area is well secured. In 1953, Chicago Housing Authority leased apartments to African American families for the first time in its Trumbull Park project in the all-white South Deering neighborhood. 10 years of sporadic mob violence ensued. The African American families required police protection during the entire period. As many as 12,000 policemen were deployed to guard African American families on the day a group of them moved in. But little was done to end the attacks by arresting and prosecuting the perpetrators. A neighborhood association The South Daring Improvement Association led the violence, but its officers were not charged with any crime. A few bomb throwers were arrested, but only after police had passively watched them launch their bombs. Just want to stop and just think about that for a second. Police watch these white people throw bombs at these African American families and did nothing. They did nothing to stop them. They did nothing to halt them. They did nothing to ensure the safety. In fact, they arrested them after the fact. I don't know if you can see the picture. That right over there. Denzel got beat up because Dominic McNeese thought he saw a gun. That was a justification for why his face looks like that. Not anything for sure. Not anything he definitely saw. Not anything that he 100% was fully sure that he had on him. Please watch these white people throw bombs at African American families and did nothing. Denzel got beat up because he alleges he saw a gun. Denzel got beat half to death because he thought he saw a gun. Because the cop thought he saw a gun. This is talking about the bomb throwers. They faced only minor charges. An observer concluded that sympathy. Sorry, I can't see. I don't got my contacts in. My fault. I can't see no comments. I'm gonna look though. Okay. An observer concluded that. No, that's the excuse they get to use to be the man. Okay. An observer concluded that sympathy for the white rioters on part of the average policeman was extreme. Addressing a South Daring Improvement Association meeting, the chief of the Chicago Park District Police commiserated with his audience that it is unfortunate that black people chose to come out here. I'm sorry that I laughed. It's just, I think it's one of those things where you can't do nothing else but laugh. The mob attacks were successful. The Chicago Housing Authority fired Elizabeth Wood, its executive director, who had authorized the leasing of apartments in the previously all-white projects to African Americans. In 1964, a civil rights activist in Bridgeport, Chicago. In 1964, a white civil rights activist in Bridgeport, Chicago Mayor Richard J. Daley's all-white neighborhood, rented an apartment to African American college students. A mob gathered and pelted the apartment with rocks. Police entered the apartment, removed the students' belongings, and told them when they returned from school that they had been evicted. 1964. 1964. What is that? What's the math on that? 2021, 1964, 57 years ago. 57 years ago this happened. That's just a generation older than me. these not this white, but these African American college students, probably still alive. I hope so. Events in Detroit and its suburbs were similar. During the immediate post-war period, the city saw more than 200 acts of intimidation and violence to deter African Americans from moving to predominantly white neighborhoods. Such an epidemic was possible because police could be counted on to stand by, making no effort, much less to prevent the assaults. Much less making no effort to stop, much less prevent the assaults. In 1964, an official of the Michigan Civil Rights Commission reported that our experience has been that nearly all attempts by black families to move to Detroit suburbs have been met with harassment. In the Philadelphia area, the attacks encountered by the Myers family were not unusual. In the first 6 months of 1955, 213 violent incidences ensured that most African Americans remained in the North Philadelphia ghetto. Some incidences involved move-in violence like that. I'm sorry, let me take this drink first. Some incidences involved move-in violence like that experienced by the Myers. Others involved white teenagers defending what they considered a neighborhood boundary that African Americans should not cross. Although, in some cases, perpetrators might have been difficult to identify, it is probable that police were incapable of finding a sufficient number to prevent repetitive conflict. In the Los Angeles area, cross burning, dynamite bombings, rocks thrown through windows, graffiti, and other acts of vandalism, as well as numerous phone threats, greeted African Americans who found housing in neighborhoods just outside their existing areas of concentration. Reading that, this is a very frustrating chapter to read. But it did make me think of it made me think of LeBron James, and he is a home in LA. I think this happened about 3 years ago, maybe 2 years ago. I believe he had just bought this home, or it was recently bought, or recently moved to this home, or something of that nature. And he was away from the house. Nobody was home, but somebody spray painted the N-word on his garage door. 2 to 3 years ago, this happened. Like I said earlier, that some of this stuff it's so ridiculous that it's almost hard to believe, but at that same time, it's so incredibly easy to believe. This is chapter 9 of The Color of Law. Almost done with chapter 9. What time is it? 4:07. Okay. Probably read this and another chapter. Then we're gonna get started with our group discussion at around 5. Okay. Let's get back into this. Okay, right here. In 1945, an entire family, father, mother, and 2 children, were killed when its new home in the all-white neighborhood was blown up. Of the more than 100 incidences of move-in bombings and vandalism that occurred in Los Angeles between 1950 and 1965, only one led to an arrest and prosecution. And that was because the California Attorney General took over the case after local police and prosecutors claimed they were unable to find anyone to charge. Although the 1968 Fair Housing Act made violence to prevent neighborhood integration of federal crime, and the Department of Justice prosecuted several cases, frequent attacks on African Americans attempting to leave predominantly black areas continued into the 1980s. The Southern Poverty Law Center found that in 1985 and 1986, only about 1/4 of these incidences were prosecuted. But the share in which charges were brought grew rapidly from 1985 to 1995, from 1985 to 1990, up to 75%. That such an increase in the rates of prosecution was possible suggests how tolerant of such crimes police and prosecutors have previously been. Still, the center documented 130 cases of move-in violence in 1989 alone. I wonder what the African American population of Cicero is right now. I'll look that up later. During the mid-20th century, local police and the FBI went through extraordinary lengths to infiltrate and disrupt liberal and left-wing political groups, as well as organized crime syndicates. That they did not act similarly in the case of a nationwide terror campaign against African Americans who integrated previously white communities should be deemed at the least complicity in the violence. Had perpetrators been held to account in even a few well-publicized cases, maybe thousands of others might have been prevented. Nor can the failure to control mob assaults be blamed on police officers who acted without explicit authorization of their supervisors. In recent years, we have seen several examples of the choices that confront public officials in the analogous situations. When a police officer has killed or beaten an African American man with apparent racial motivation, we now expect that the officer's superiors will fire him or her, or I don't have. That's not a thought that I have in my head. I think I have. Ideally, we would like to see these officers get fired. Ideally, we would like to see in 2020 3.5. Oh, okay. That's surprising. What does it say? Okay. It says we expect the officer. Okay, let's read this again. When a police officer has killed or beaten an African American man with apparent racial motivation, we now expect that the officer's superiors will fire him or her. That's not true. Sadly, I say that sadly. I say that reluctantly. That's not the case. There has been since 1990 there has been 50 incidences of deadly force used by the Rockford Police Department in Winnebago County and police departments in Winnebago. There's police departments in Winnebago County. All 50 have been ruled justified. Nobody has been fired for making somebody's face look like how Denzel's face looks. Nobody has been fired for that. And in fact, cops have gotten promotion for that. Cops have gotten promotions for killing somebody. Timothy Seck killed somebody and he got an award for killing somebody. Frank Bajecki killed Mike Sago and shot 3 other young men and he got an award for that. Frank Bajecki's running for office now. He lost, by the way. He lost. We don't expect these cops to get fired. I don't expect Carla Red to get fired. I don't expect any of the cops that happened on May 30th, that saw the people on May 30th. I don't expect them to get fired. I want them to get fired. I think that's one of the demands, that they do be fired. But I don't have it in my head at all that they can be fired. I don't have it in my mind at all that there'll be any accountability within the police department. I don't have it in my mind at all that in any situation that I'm right here right now. I've been arrested 6 different times. A cop could come up to me right now and shoot me, and that would be justified. A cop could come up here, shoot me right now, kill me right now, and that would be ruled justified. I do not expect any of these officers in Rockford and Winnebago County to ever be held justifiable, to ever be held accountable. There have been 50 cases since 1990, and they all have been ruled justified. Kurt Wisan killed somebody in 1997. He's a deputy chief right now. He's the second highest ranking officer beneath Dan O'Shea right now. Carla Red shot at people. She's an assistant deputy chief. Mike Dalkey, he's a assistant deputy commander. He had a case. He was sued for beating this man terribly. He got sued. And what did he say about? I'm gonna get the quote wrong. He said these women are stronger than they look, and talking about black women. Who else? Randy Burke shot somebody. New District 1 commander Randy Burke shot somebody. Doug Pan, the current Doug Pan, who's about to retire, shot somebody. These officers who have these cases where it's clear that it's racial motivation. Oda Poole had 6 different incidences of shooting people. Oda Poole had 6 different incidences by the time he left the police force. And the police union fought for him every step of the way. Every step of the way, they fought for him. They loved him. That was their boy. They loved him. And he ended up getting a $700,000 settlement for his retirement pension. No, I do not expect any of these cops to ever be held accountable. No, I do not expect them to be fired. Do we demand they be fired? But if it came out today that Frank Fabiani, the cop that had brought charges against him and who had was a video was released with Sage. If it came out after that video that Frank Fabiani was fired, I don't even know what to think. That would be completely out of the blue. That would be out of character for them. That would completely be antithetical to anything that they have ever done in the last however many years that this police department has been around. If they decided today to fire a cop for shooting somebody, if they decided today to fire Dominic Maniques for shooting Tyrus, or for for beating Denzel like how he did, that would be out of character. That would be out of the blue. That would be completely opposite of everything they have ever done. I'm going to keep going. Okay. If there is doubt about whether a citizen's civil rights were violated will suspend the officer pending an investigation. If superiors fail to take such measures, we expect still higher authorities to intervene. If they do not, we can reasonably assume that a police officer's approach fit within the bounds of what his or her superiors consider appropriate response and reflect governmental policy. Okay. I agree with the end of that. What did Carla Red say when she ruled all the May 30th assaults justified? Oh, that's all within policy. Kicking, hitting, slamming, pulling. That's all well within policy. That's all within the way things are designed to be. I agree with that last part. In 1950, let me wait for this plane to go by. I don't know where this plane is. The plane sounds real loud. In 1954, Andrew Wade, an African-American electrical contractor and Korean War Navy veteran, wanted to purchase a house in a middle-class African-American neighborhood of Louisville, Kentucky, but couldn't find anything suitable. A friend and prominent left-wing activist, Carl Braden, suggested he look at a white, middle-class community instead. Braden and his wife, Anne, then agreed to buy a house for Andrew Wade and his wife, Charlotte. The Wades found a property in Chevelle, an all-white suburb, which the Bradens bought, signing over the deed. When the Wades and their child were moving in, a crowd gathered in front, and a cross was burned on an empty lot next door. On the first evening the family spent at home, a rock crashed through the front window with a message tied to it. They used the N-word, "Get out." And this is a picture of the family. This is, I don't know how well you can see, but this right here, this is Andrew Wade. That's their daughter Charlotte, I believe. Oh, no. I'm sorry. This is Charlotte. Charlotte's the wife, and Rosemary's the daughter, I believe. Yeah, Rosemary's the daughter, and this is Andrew, and this is their home. This is their home after rocks were hurled through the windows. The destruction that people had. Okay. So after that happened with the rocket and crash through with a message tied to it, later that night, 10 rifle shots were fired through the glass of its kitchen door. Under the watch of a police guard, demonstrations continued for a month until the house was dynamited. The police guard said he saw nothing. There was one arrest following the Wades moving in, of Andrew Wade and a friend for breach of peace, because Mr. Wade had failed to notify the police that the friend would be visiting. The police chief was familiar enough with the bombers to warn Carl Braden that the people responsible for blowing up the raid property were targeting the Braden home next. Although the chief acknowledged that both the dynamiter and crossburners have confessed, the perpetrators were not indicted. Instead, a grand jury indicted Carl and Ann Braden, along with four others whom the jury accused of conspiring to stir up racial conflict by selling the house to African Americans. The formal charge was sedition. Charges against the others were dropped, but Carl Braden was sentenced to 15 years in prison. He eventually won release on appeal and the Wades went back to Louisville's African American area. Such violence in Kentucky did not end in the 1950s. In 1985, Robert and Martha Marshall bought a home in Sylvania, another suburb of Louisville that had remained exclusively white. 1985. In 1985, my father was born. My father was born in 1980. Their house was firebombed on... Wow. Their house was firebombed on the night they moved in. A month later, a second arson attack destroyed the house. A few hours before a Ku Klux Klan meeting at which speaker boasted that no African Americans would be permitted to live in Sylvania. The Marshall family then sued a county police officer who had been identified as a member of the Klan. The officer testified that about half of the 40 Klan members known to him were also in the police department, and that his superiors condoned officers' Klan membership, as long as the information did not become public. Many years ago, I read The Wall Between, Anne Braden's memoir that described how she and her husband were prosecuted by the state of Kentucky for helping Andrew Wade attempt to live in a white neighborhood. I remember that account when, in 2007, the U.S. Supreme Court prohibited the Louisville School District from carrying out a racial integration plan on the grounds that the segregation of Louisville is a product not of state action but of private choices. By whom? By whom? My private choices, meaning if a black person moved into the wrong area, they'd be met with the same actions that are the same response that the Marshall family or the Gary family were met with, or the Myers family were met with. State-sponsored violence was a means, along with many others, by which all levels of government maintained segregation in Louisville and elsewhere. The Wades and Marshalls were only two middle-class families confronted with hostile state power when they tried to cross the residential color line. How many other middle-class African Americans in Louisville were intimidated for attempting to live in neighborhoods of their own choosing after hearing of the Wade and Marshall experience? Did the next generation inhibit a fear of integration from their parents? How long did the memories of such events last? How long did they continue to intimidate? Wow. I'm really happy that we read Until We Reckon yesterday, because it had talked a lot about victims and what the victims think, and how a victim isn't healed by somebody getting a long prison term. A victim isn't healed by someone getting sentenced to 20 years in prison. That trauma that victim had, the trauma that victim has, it's still there. It doesn't disappear when that sentencing date happens. So this idea that, let's see, this young child, Rosemary, she's a young girl in 1954, so she would be probably in her 70s right by now. I wouldn't be surprised if there were still some days where she woke up and she had dreams of her house getting shot up by this white mob, or if she had night terrors of rocks getting thrown and epithets and slurs being thrown at her and not as an infant, but as a toddler. Okay, what time is it? It's 4:30. Okay, how many chapters? I think there's 12 chapters. We're on chapter 10. But there's also a pretty decently sized epilogue. So let's see. Let me just see where we are at and how long chapter 10 is. I cannot find it. Chapter 10 is 24 pages. We can get through that right now. This is chapter 10 of The Color of Law. Suppress incomes. Let me see. Sorry, my fault. Trying to make the hearing better. Trying to make the hearing better. Excuse me. Hold on, no. That's what I'm gonna do. You know what? I'm gonna end this live right now. I'm gonna use the bathroom. Unless Terry wanna read. Hold on, I'll be right back. Okay, we're gonna stay on this live. Terry's gonna read the chapter, and then we'll probably do a group discussion about 5:30, closer to 6. All right.
Chapter 10. Hello. Here we are. Rainy Thursday. Ongoing teach-in at Say Their Name Square. We got half a table that's dry. Okay. Chapter 10, page 153 of The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. A common explanation for de facto segregation is that most black families could not afford to live in predominantly white middle-class communities and still are unable to do so. African Americans' isolation, the argument goes, reflects their low incomes, not de jure segregation. Racial segregation will persist until more African Americans improve their educations and then are able to earn enough to move out of high poverty neighborhoods. The explanation at first seems valid, but we cannot understand the income and wealth gap that persists between African Americans and whites without examining governmental policies that purposely kept black incomes low throughout most of the 20th century. Once government implemented these policies, economic differences became self-perpetuating. It is not possible, but it is rare for Americans, black or white, to have a higher rank in the national income distribution than their parents. Everyone's standard of living may grow from generation to generation, but an individual's relative income, how it compares to the incomes of others in the present generation, is remarkably similar to how his or her parents' incomes compare to others in their generation. So an account of de jure residential segregation has to include not only how public policy geographically separated African Americans from whites, but also how federal and state labor market policies with undisguised racial intent depressed African American wages. In addition, some and perhaps many local governments taxed African Americans more heavily than whites. The effects of these government actions were compounded because neighborhood segregation itself imposed higher expenses on African Americans than on white families, even if their wages and tax rates had been identical. The result, smaller disposable incomes and fewer savings for black families, denying them the opportunity to accumulate wealth and contributing to make housing in middle class communities unaffordable. If government purposefully depressed the incomes of African Americans, with the result that they were priced out of mainstream housing markets, then these economic policies are also important parts of the architecture of de jure segregation. Until long after emancipation from slavery, most African Americans were denied access to free labor markets and were unable to save from wages. This denial of access was another badge of slavery that Congress was duty-bound to eliminate, not to perpetuate. Following the Civil War and intensifying after Reconstruction, a sharecropping system of indentured servitude perpetuated aspects of the slave system. After food and other living costs were deducted from their earnings, sharecroppers typically owed plantation owners more than their wages due. Local sheriffs enforced this peonage, preventing sharecroppers from seeking work elsewhere by arresting, assaulting, or murdering those who attempted to leave, or by condoning violence perpetuated by owners. In many instances, African Americans were arrested for petty and phony offenses, like vagrancy if they came to town when off work. And when they were unable to pay fines and court fees, wardens sometimes sold prisoners to plantations, mines, and factories. Douglas Blackman, in his book Slavery by Another Name, estimates that from the end of Reconstruction until World War II, the number enslaved in this way exceeded 100,000. Mines operated by U.S. Steel alone used tens of thousands of imprisoned African Americans. The practice ebbed during World War II, but it wasn't until 1951 that Congress fulfilled its 13th Amendment obligation and explicitly outlawed the practice. Some African Americans managed to escape to the North early in the 20th century, yet others were forcibly prevented or intimidated from doing so. But during World War I, when immigration of unskilled Europeans was sharply curtailed, Northern manufacturers sent recruiters south. They frequently traveled in disguise, pretending, for example, to be insurance salesmen to avoid capture by sheriffs. During this time, more than 600,000 African Americans left the South, mostly to seek work in the North and Midwest. Historians call this the First Great Migration. World War II then spurred the Second Great Migration from 1940 to 1970, when more than 4 million African Americans made the journey. Thus, most African Americans could not begin to accumulate capital for home purchases until fairly recently, well after European immigrant groups were able to participate in the wage economy. And when African Americans who left the South entered a northern labor market, federal, state, and local governments collaborated with private employers to ensure that they were paid less and treated worse than whites. Part 2, Chapter 10. In the 1930s, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt could assemble the congressional majorities he needed to adopt New Deal legislation only by including Southern Democrats who were fiercely committed to white supremacy. In consequence, Social Security, minimum wage protection, and the recognition of labor unions all excluded from coverage occupations in which African Americans predominated. Agriculture and domestic service. State and local governments behaved similarly. When, for example, in the 1930s, St. Louis constructed a segregated hospital for African American patients, a contractor hired a single black tile setter. White union members protested, and the city fired the contractor and announced it would no longer use any firm that employed African American labor. The Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, segregated its workers on the job as well as in housing. At construction projects, African Americans were assigned to work separately, but only if enough were needed at particular sites to make up full crews. If not, then African Americans were denied work entirely. No African Americans were permitted to be promoted to foreman or other supervisory roles in the TVA. The first national New Deal program, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, adopted in 1933, disproportionately spent its funds on unemployed whites, frequently refused to permit African Americans to take any but the least skilled jobs, and even in those paid them less than the officially stipulated wage. Similar policies later prevailed under the National Recovery Administration, NRA, another New Deal agency established in Roosevelt's first year. It established industry by industry minimum wages, maximum hours, and product prices. Codes routinely withheld benefits from African Americans that white workers enjoyed. In addition to agriculture and domestic service, the NRA did not cover sub-industries and even individual factory types in which African Americans predominated. Canning, citrus packing, and cotton ginning were industrial, not agricultural jobs, but workers were usually African American, and so they were denied the NRA's wage and hour standards. The NRA took account of the lower cost of living in the South by setting lower wages in the region. In Delaware, 90% of fertilizer manufacturing workers were African American, thus fertilizer plants were classified as Southern, while other factories in the state that hired whites were classified as Northern, so higher minimum wages applied. The first industrial code that the administration negotiated with business leaders in 1933 increased minimum wages in the cotton textile industry, resulting in price increases through the production chain, including retail clothing, but the agreement bypassed jobs in which African Americans predominated: cleaners, outside crews, and yardmen. Of the 14,000 African Americans in the industry, 10,000 held one of these job classifications. The NAACP complained, for these workers, the NRA meant increases of from 10 to 40% in the cost of everything they had to buy without a single penny in increased wages. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, not only segregated residential camps, but allowed local policies that did not permit African Americans to enroll or restricted them to menial jobs in which they could not develop the higher skills that the Corps was meant to provide. Florida announced that it would not accept African Americans, while Texas officials declared that this work is for whites only. Many other states had long waiting lists of eligible African Americans because localities refused to allow the CCC to establish camps to lodge them. Where the Army set up segregated camps, it did not permit African Americans to lead the units, assigning white commanders instead. CCC sites usually had educational programs, but Army officers often refused to hire black teachers, leaving educational advisor positions vacant. African American Corps members were also rarely allowed to upgrade to better paying jobs like machine operators or clerks, even if they'd had experience as civilians. The painter Jacob Lawrence worked as a youth at Breeze Hill. a segregated camp for African Americans about 70 miles northwest of New York City, where 1,400 young men shoveled mud for a flood control project. Not one could be promoted to a higher classification. My father-in-law told how in a white CCC camp he claimed to know how to type, although his skills were minimal, then quickly learned to do so after persuading a supervisor to give him a clerk's job. He was then able to send a few dollars back to his parents, helping to keep them and his younger brothers and sister from losing their home. African American youths who already knew how to type or were equally capable of faking it had no such opportunities. Anecdotes like these multiplied tens of thousands of times, help to explain the different African American and white economic conditions during the Depression and afterward. Part 3 of Chapter 10. In 1935, President Roosevelt signed the National Labor Relations Act, granting unions at construction sites and factories the right to bargain with management if the unions were supported by a majority of workers. Labor organizations that gained this official certification could negotiate contracts that covered all of a firm's employees. The original bill proposed by Senator Robert Wagner of New York had prohibited government certification of unions that did not grant African Americans membership and workplace rights. The American Federation of Labor, AFL, lobbied Wagner to remove the clause, and he did so. The enactment of the Wagner Act was accomplished with the knowledge that it sanctioned an unconstitutional policy of legally empowering unions that refused to admit African Americans. For at least the next 30 years, the government protected the bargaining rights of unions that denied African Americans the privileges of membership or that segregated them into janitorial and other low-paid jobs. In some cases, newly certified unions used their collective bargaining rights to force companies to fire African Americans who had been employed before unionization. In the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, the agency delegated to administer the act, did nothing in response. In New York, for example, the NLRB certified building service employees union forced Manhattan hotels, restaurants, and offices to fire African American elevator operators and restaurant workers and then give the jobs to whites. Part 4 of Chapter 10. The government's participation in blocking African Americans' wage earning opportunities had its most devastating effect during World War II, when black voters migrated to centers of war production in search of jobs. The Roosevelt administration required factories to convert from civilian to military production. The Army and Navy effectively operated shipbuilding yards, munitions makers, and aircraft and tank manufacturers. Yet federal agencies both tolerated and supported joint management union policies that kept African Americans from doing any but the most poorly paid tasks in defense plants. Events in the San Francisco Bay Area, where Allen and Frank Stevenson sought work during the war, were typical. The region was the largest center of war-related shipbuilding in the nation. The Marine Labor's Union, which had 7 members in 1941, grew to more than 30,000 during the next few years. The Steamfitters Union membership soared from 400 to 17,000. Unions like these had NLRB certified agreements that companies could not hire without a union referral, and the unions would not refer African Americans. From 1941 to 1943, the Henry J. Kaiser Company built 4 shipyards in Richmond with a capacity for 1,115,000 jobs. It could not recruit enough white men for all of them, so it began to take on white women. By 1944, women made up 27% of Kaiser's Richmond workforce. Then, when the supply of white women also exhausted, Kaiser sent agents to the South to seek African American men. By the war's end, still short of workers, defense industries opened some industrial jobs to African American women who were previously employed only as janitors, cafeteria workers, and restroom attendants. After 4 years of fierce conflict with union activists, Ford Motor finally recognized the UAW as its workers' representative in 1941. Faced with a labor shortage that threatened its military contracts, the company hired African Americans like Frank Stevenson. Initially, Ford would not permit them to work in the higher-paid paint department, or as a foreman, electricians, or in other skilled crafts. But as the union got stronger, activists like Ben Gross pressed Ford to open more classifications to African Americans. The UAW was part of the new, more egalitarian Congress of Industrial Organizations. Shipyard workers, however, were most likely represented by the more conservative AFL. So while Stevenson brothers became full-fledged union members, AFL unions mostly would not permit African Americans to join. There were a few exceptions. 90% of the shipyard laborers union was African American because it represented workers in the lowest paid occupations, like unskilled maintenance, in which whites were rarely found. But the largest union in the industry, the International Brotherhood of Boilermakers, Iron Shipbuilders, and Helpers of America, representing about 70% of all shipyard workers, had signed a 1940 contract with Kaiser and other shipbuilders providing that only union members could work. The Boilermakers Constitution prohibited African Americans from enrolling. Under its NLRB certified contract, the Kaiser Company could recruit non-members only if the union lists had been exhausted. But before going on the job, these hires had to join the union. Unable to supply enough white workers but unwilling to admit African Americans, the Boilermakers established segregated auxiliary union chapters. In 1943, their first year of operation, the auxiliaries placed 10,000 African Americans in shipyards and other industries where the Boilermakers controlled jobs. Auxiliary members had to pay dues to the white local but were not permitted to file grievances or vote in union elections. They received fringe benefits worth about half what white members received. The union did not assist black workers in advancing to better paid jobs, and African Americans would not promote to foreman if the role involved supervising whites. Even if fully qualified African Americans performed skilled work, the shipyards classified and paid them as trainees. One Kaiser worker went to a civil rights meeting in protest of these policies. The company fired him for attending. The NAACP filed an NLRB complaint regarding these practices. The agency criticized the Boilermakers' policy but maintained its certification of the whites-only union. At least 29 other national unions either excluded African Americans entirely or restricted them to second-class auxiliaries. In the post-war years, some unions began to desegregate voluntarily, but federal agencies continued to recognize segregated unions within the government itself until 1962, when President Kennedy banned the practice. Nonetheless, the Post Office's National Association of Letter Carriers did not permit African Americans to join in some areas until the 1970s. African American mailmen could not file grievances to protest mistreatment and instead had to join a catch-all organization for African Americans, the National Alliance of Postal Employees. a union mostly serving truck drivers, sorters, and miscellaneous lower-paid job categories. The alliance, one member later recalled, didn't have the clout with the local postmaster the way the letter carriers did. So African Americans were less likely to receive promotions, consideration of vacation time preferences, and other job rights. The construction trades continued to exclude African Americans during the home and highway construction booms of the post-war years, so black workers did not share with whites the substantial income gains that blue-collar workers realized in the two big wage growth periods of the mid-20th century, war production and subsequent suburbanization. African Americans were neither permitted to live in the new suburbs nor for the most part to boost their incomes by participating in suburban construction. In 1964, the NLRB finally refused to certify whites-only unions. Although policy was now changed, the agency offered African Americans no remedy for decades of income suppression that flowed from its unconstitutional embrace of segregation. Still another decade passed before African Americans were admitted to most AFL craft unions. But seniority rules meant it would take many more years for them to achieve incomes in these trades that were comparable to whites. Racial income inequality by then was firmly established and suburban segregation was mostly complete. Part 5 of Chapter 10. In 1941, A. Philip Randolph, national president of the Pullman Car Porters Union, organized the Civil Rights March on Washington to demand that President Roosevelt ban the segregation and exclusion of African Americans in defense industries. The president stalled for months trying to convince civil rights leaders to call off the march, but less than a week before it was scheduled, he persuaded Randolph to cancel the demonstration in return for an executive order prohibiting racial discrimination by unions and management in government-controlled war industries. While some firms complied, the new policy was toothless. The order created a Fair Employment Practices Committee, FEPC, that could recommend cancellation of defense contracts in cases of persistent discrimination. But at the West Coast FEPC office, for example, no such recommendation was ever made. The FEPC had jurisdiction over any firm that was related to the war effort, such as non-military hospitals that might be called upon to treat wounded soldiers. Yet the San Francisco FEPC director was unable to get San Francisco's medical centers to admit African American physicians. President Roosevelt ensured the agency's weakness by naming Mark Etheridge, publisher of the Louisville Courier-Journal, as the committee's first chairman. In a speech following his appointment, Etheridge praised segregation in defense plants. A public uproar forced his resignation, but he remained as an FEPC member, stating that non-discrimination was a federal order. In the Nazi dictator pattern, and not even the mechanized armies of the earth, Allied or Axis, could now force the Southern white people to give up the principle of social segregation in war industries. There's an asterisk. 13 years later, Mark Etheridge was still publisher of his Louisville newspaper when Andrew Wade attempted to occupy the home he had bought from Carl and Ann Braden. As violence flared at the Wade residence, the Courier-Journal published an editorial urging the mob to use proper legal procedures to evict the Wades, even though these events occurred 6 years after the Supreme Court had found that no such legal procedures were permissible. Etheridge's editorial stated, The real fault of judgment, in our opinion, lies with Mr. and Mrs. Carl Braden. Their white neighbors are entirely within their rights in protesting the purchase of property in their subdivision by Negroes, and there is no use denying that the value of their property was decreased as a result of the sale. FEPC accomplishments were small. On one occasion, 2 skilled African American steamfitters in the Richmond shipyards filed a complaint with the committee over their relegation to the auxiliary local. The union agreed to create an exception for these 2, provided that its policy covering all others would be unchanged. On another occasion, an African American was refused work at the Bethlehem Shipbuilding Company in San Francisco because the machinists union would not admit African Americans to membership. The FEPC called the union leaders to a hearing, but they ignored the invitation and no further action was taken. Like cities nationwide, San Francisco practiced discrimination in public employment and its public utilities, such as telephone companies, which at the time were very heavily regulated because they had local monopolies. Pacific Telephone and Telegraph, one of the region's largest firms, did not have a single black operator. It hired African Americans only as janitors for similar low-level work, and it even refused an FEPC request that issue a statement saying it would comply with the president's non-discrimination order. The city's streetcar system refused to hire African Americans until 1942. Maya Angelou, who lied about her age to get a conductor's job as a teenager, was one of the first, indicating the considerable availability of qualified African American workers in the Bay Area. Within 2 years of the new policy, there were 700 black platform operators when there had been none at the beginning of the war. In 1943, at the Marin shipyard in Sausalito, where workers' dormitories had been unintentionally integrated after recruits arrived too rapidly to be separated by race, half of the African American workers refused to pay dues to the segregated branch of the Boilermakers. The union then demanded that Marin ship dismiss the delinquent African Americans, and the shipyard complied. The California Attorney General and the Navy Admiral in charge of the area shipbuilding pressed the workers to abandon their protest and rejoin the segregated auxiliary, but when they refused, the officials urged Marin ship, without success, to cancel the layoffs. At an FEPC hearing, the union argued that it was in full compliance with the president's order because no African American was denied work if he paid his dues, the same requirement that applied to whites. The FEPC rejected this claim but suspended the ruling pending a company appeal. The black Marin ship workers then sued, but a federal judge concluded that the workers had no relevant rights under the federal Constitution or any federal statutes. The African Americans then took their case to California state courts, where a judge suspended the firings, pending a company appeal. Eventually, in 1945, the California Supreme Court upheld the order, stating in unprecedented language that racial discrimination is contrary to the public policy of the United States and this state. The Boilermakers complied with the decisions, but they had come too late. At the time of the California Supreme Court ruling, 25,000 African Americans worked in area shipyards, but the war was ending. 8 months later, the number had dropped to 12,000. And in another 9 months, the shipyards shut down and virtually all its employees were laid off. The FEPC was similarly ineffective elsewhere. Lockheed and North American Aviation in Los Angeles and Boeing in Seattle only hired African Americans as janitors. When labor shortages forced these defense contractors to open other categories, the companies denied equal compensation and job rights to the black workers. In Kansas City, Standard Steel responded to the FEPC by saying, "We have not had a Negro working in 25 years and do not plan to start now." In St. Louis, the small arms ammunition plant employed 40,000 workers at the height of World War II and initially refused to hire African Americans. It responded to civil rights demonstrations by setting up a segregated production line for black workers and agreed to include them on an integrated line only when the war was winding down and most workers were laid off. Non-compliance with the president's non-discrimination order did not affect companies' federal contracts, partly because the Roosevelt administration's enthusiasm for racial equality, while genuine, was lukewarm. More important was the president's conviction, hard to dispute, that every other objective had to be subordinated to winning the war. But even granting this premise, the unconstitutional treatment of African Americans called for remediation, if not during the war, then afterward. Yet the federal government's complicity in the suppression of African American labor rights and opportunities was never addressed, not then and not since. A government-backed dual labor market continued after the war's end. In 1944, the GI Bill was adopted to support returning servicemen. The VA not only denied African Americans the mortgage subsidies to which they were entitled, but frequently restricted education and training to lower-level jobs for African Americans who were qualified to acquire greater skills. In some cases, local benefit administrators refused to process applications to four-year colleges for African Americans, directing them to vocational schools instead. Servicemen with dishonorable discharges were ineligible for benefits under the GI Bill, and African American soldiers disproportionately received dishonorable discharges, some for protesting segregation in Army towns. Asterisk. At the end of World War II, dishonorable discharges were issued to African American soldiers at nearly twice the rate of white soldiers. In 1944, Jackie Robinson was arrested and tried in a general court-martial when he was an Army lieutenant stationed at Fort Hood, Texas. His crime was refusing to move to the segregated section of a bus. Robinson, who 3 years later would be the first African American to play Major League Baseball, was already nationally known as an athlete, and the Army might have feared arousing unrest in the African American community if he was convicted. Also, during his trial, the Army finally prohibited segregation on buses that transported soldiers. Probably for both of these reasons, he was not convicted. Had Robinson been dishonorably discharged, the Brooklyn Dodgers would undoubtedly have refused to hire him, and the trajectory of civil rights in the 20th century would have been retarded at least. Your puppy dog. Raining. Part 6, Chapter 10. In the mid-20th century, job seekers depended on state employment offices for referrals to vacancies and training programs. As a war measure in 1942, these agencies were put under the control of a federal organization, the U.S. Employment Service, which generally refused to enroll African Americans in training for skilled work. Its instructions to local offices advised that if a company failed to specify a racial exclusion in its request for workers, the office should solicit one, assuming that the firm might have overlooked the opportunity to state it. These practices continued after the war. When placement and training services were returned to state control, in 1948, for example, 45% of all job orders placed with the Michigan State Employment Service were for whites only. Despite a severe labor shortage during much of the post-war period, Although African Americans were available, many jobs went unfilled. Michigan did not adopt a fair employment practices law until 1955, and even then it was poorly enforced. A 1960s executive order covering contractors on federally funded construction projects prohibited racial discrimination and required affirmative action to recruit African Americans. Yet when a new central post office was authorized for Oakland, California, on land cleared by displacing more than 300 families, mostly African American, not a single black plumber, operating engineer, sheet metal worker, iron worker, electrician, or steam fitter was hired for its construction. When the Bay Area Rapid Transit Subway System, or BART, was built in 1967, not a single African American skilled worker was hired to work on it. The Office of Federal Contract Compliance blamed the unions, all certified by the NLRB, but not admitting black members. The BART general manager allowed that although BART was committed to equal opportunity, it was unwilling to insist on non-discrimination because that might provoke a union work stoppage, and our prime responsibility to the public is to deliver the system as nearly on time as we possibly can. Although federal regulations provided for termination of a contractor for failing to comply with the non-discrimination order, no penalty was imposed. Even today, African Americans continue to have lesser rights in NLRB certified unions. In 2015, New York City's Sheet Metal Workers Union began paying $13 million in compensation to African Americans who, although union members, received fewer job assignments than whites from 1991 to 2006. Ongoing litigation over similar discrimination by NLRB certified unions that also participate in government contracts involves Chicago pipe fitters, Philadelphia operating engineers, and New York City iron workers. For many African American workers, the discrimination meant that, unlike white unionists, they were able to afford housing in integrated middle-class communities. Oh, blowing. Part 7 of Chapter 10 of The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. Page 169. African Americans could save less from their wages because in some, perhaps many cities, discriminatory property assessments left them with less disposable income than whites with similar earnings. A homeowner's property tax is calculated by taking the property's assessed value, usually set by a county tax assessor, and multiplying it by the tax rate set by a municipal government agency, a city, county, school district, water district, fire district, etc. The total tax rate is the sum of rates set by each of these public entities. Each one sets its property tax rate by dividing its total budgeted expenditures, how much it expects to spend in the coming year, by the total assessed value of all properties in its jurisdiction. Assessed values do not have to be the same as market values, but a fair and non-discriminatory system requires that all properties be assessed at the same percentage of their market values. Whether a tax assessor says that assessed value should be 20% of market values or 200% of market values, homeowners pay the same dollar amount of tax after the calculations are completed. If the city's total assessed value is high, dividing it into the budget will yield a low rate. If the city's total assessed value is low, dividing it into the same budget will yield a high rate. A low rate multiplied by a high value will yield the same tax revenue as a high rate multiplied by a low value. But an assessor can undermine tax fairness by using different percentages of market value in different communities. By doing this in the mid-20th century, city and county governments extracted excessive taxes from African Americans. These governments did so by overassessing properties in black neighborhoods and underassessing them in white ones. Although assessors may have had a bias that led them to assess houses of lower income families of any race at a higher percentage of their market values than houses of affluent families of any race. This alone cannot explain the differences. A 1979 study of Chicago assessments, for example, included a statistical analysis demonstrating that the chances of these differences being attributable to social class bias alone were less than 1 in 100. Homeowners have no way of knowing about the underassessment in other neighborhoods. African Americans felt that their property taxes were excessive, but typically could not identify the cause. This made racial discrimination by assessors especially pernicious. Taxpayers have a natural tendency to be pleased when the assessor gives a high value to their property. It makes them feel wealthier, increasing their equity on paper. But what an assessor says about property value can affect the potential sale price of a home. Higher assessed values only mean that tax payments will be higher if other properties are not overassessed in the same way. Whether some neighborhoods are overassessed and others underassessed is difficult to study. It requires painstaking property by property comparisons of assessed value and market value. Since it is impossible to know with certainty what the market value might be of a property that has not recently been sold, studies can't be terribly precise. Nonetheless, studies of Albany, Boston, Buffalo, Chicago, Fort Worth, and Norfolk have documented the higher effective property tax burdens borne by African Americans. An investigation of 1962 assessment practices in Boston, for example, found that assessed values in the African American community of Roxbury were 68% of market values, while assessed values in the nearby white middle class community of West Roxbury were 41% of market values. The researchers could not find a non-racial explanation for the difference. 17 years later, an analysis of Chicago assessments found the most underassessed neighborhood to be Bridgeport, the all-white home of Mayor Richard J. Daley, where resistance to African Americans was among the most violent in the nation. Bridgeport assessed values were about 50% lower than the legally prescribed ratio of assessed to market value. In the nearby African American North Lawndale neighborhood, they were about 200% higher than the legally prescribed ratio. Wow. In a 1973 study of 10 large U.S. cities, the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development found a systematic pattern of overassessment in low-income African American neighborhoods with corresponding underassessment in white middle-class neighborhoods. The study revealed that in Baltimore, the property tax burden in the white middle-class community of Guilford, near Johns Hopkins University, was 1/9 that of African American East Baltimore. In Philadelphia, the burden in white middle class South Philadelphia was 1/6 that of African American lower North Philadelphia. In Chicago, the burden in white middle class Norwood was 1/2 that of African American Woodlawn. The report provoked no action by the U.S. Department of Justice. Considering all these studies, the differences are too stark and consistent to make benign explanations likely. The higher The higher property taxes paid by African American owners and through their landlords by African American renters contributed to the deterioration of their neighborhoods. After taxes, families had fewer funds left for maintenance, and some were forced to take in boarders or extended family members to pay their property taxes. In Chicago, excessive taxation also led to loss of homes by African Americans because speculators were permitted to pay off delinquent tax liabilities and then seize the properties, evict the owners, and then resell the houses at enormous profit. Because African Americans' property taxes were often higher relative to market value, black families were more likely to be delinquent in tax payments and more likely to be prey for speculators who could seize their houses after paying off the taxes due. There are no contemporary studies of assessed to market value ratios by community and by race, so we cannot say whether discriminatory tax assessment persists to the present time, and if so, in which communities. In cities like Baltimore and Cleveland, however, African Americans are still more likely than whites to lose homes through tax lien repossessions. Costs of segregation attributable to discriminatory assessment practices suffered by an unknown number of African Americans are not trivial. This was not simply a result of vague and ill-defined structural racism, but a direct consequence of county assessors' contempt for their 14th Amendment responsibilities, another expression of de jure segregation. Part 8 of Chapter 10. The creation of racial ghettos was self-perpetuating. Residence in a community where economic disadvantage is concentrated itself depresses disposable income, which makes departure more difficult. Restricting African Americans' housing supply led to higher rents and home prices in black neighborhoods than for similar accommodations in predominantly white ones. If African Americans had access to housing throughout metropolitan areas, supply and demand balances would have kept their rents and home prices at reasonable levels. Without access, landlords and sellers were free to take advantage of the greater demand relative to supply for African American housing. This exploitation persisted throughout the 20th century and was well understood by economists and social welfare experts. African Americans, of course, understood it as well. In his autobiography, Langston Hughes described how when his family lived in Cleveland in the 1910s, landlords could get as much as 3 times the rent from African Americans that they could from whites, because so few homes were available to black families outside a few integrated urban neighborhoods. Landlords, Hughes remembered, subdivided apartments designed for a single family into 5 or 6 units, and still African Americans' income had to be disproportionately devoted to rent. 4 decades later, little had changed. In its 1947 brief to the Supreme Court in Shelley v. Kramer, the U.S. government cited half a dozen studies, each of which demonstrated that colored people are forced to pay higher rents and housing costs by the semi-monopoly which segregation fosters. In 1954, the FHA estimated that African Americans were overcrowded at more than 4 times the rate of whites and were doubled up at 3 times the rate of whites because of the excessive rents they were forced to pay. A Chicago Department of Welfare report in the mid-1920s stated that African Americans were charged about 20% more in rent than whites for similar dwellings. It also observed that in neighborhoods undergoing racial change, rents increased by 50 to 225% when African Americans occupied apartments that formerly housed whites. The limited supply of housing open to African Americans gave property owners in black neighborhoods the opportunity to make exorbitant profits. A 1946 National Magazine article described a Chicago building where the landlord had divided a 540 square foot storefront into 6 cubicles, each housing a family. He had similarly subdivided the second story. Total monthly rent was as great as that generated by a luxury apartment on Chicago's Gold Coast along Lake Michigan. The article recounted another case where rents were so high that 38 people lived in a 6-room apartment, sleeping in 3 shifts. In 1947, after a Chicago landlord converted his property from white to black tenancy, a fire killed 10 African American tenants. The inquest revealed that a white tenant who had been paying $15 a month was evicted so that the landlord could charge a black family $60 for the same apartment. Such exploitation was possible only because public policy denied African American opportunities to participate in the city's white housing market. Other urban housing markets were similarly distorted. A 1923 Philadelphia survey found that as the first Great Migration proceeded, nearly twice as many African Americans as white tenants had faced rent hikes the previous year. The average increase for African Americans was 18%, for whites 12%. For African Americans was 18%, for whites 12%. In 1938, African Americans' median rent in Manhattan was as much as 50% greater than the median for whites, although African Americans had lower incomes. These inequities were exacerbated during World War II and its aftermath, when the Office of Price Administration froze rents nationwide. Without violating regulations, landlords subdivided apartments in already crowded urban areas and then charged more. These higher costs accumulated throughout the 20th century, making it more difficult for African Americans, even with stable employment, to save. Reduced savings made it less likely they could afford even modest down payments for houses in middle-class neighborhoods, were such homes made available to them. Part 9, Chapter 10 of The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. The Richmond, California Ford plant had a sister facility in Edgewater, New Jersey on the Hudson River just south of George Washington Bridge. The same technological factors that made the Richmond plant obsolete in the 1950s affected the Edgewater plant. Locked in by a river on one side and the Palisades Cliffs on the other, the facility had no room to expand to serve a growing customer base in the post-war boom. New highways made it no longer necessary for the plant to have its own deepwater port, so its inefficient elevator system was a needless burden. When Ford shifted the Richmond plant to Milpitas in 1955, it also moved the Edgewater plant to the suburb of Mahwah, about 25 miles to the northwest. The Edgewater workforce, older and mostly white, was able to commute to the new plant without great difficulty from homes in the Edgewater area. But as these workers retired, their jobs were taken by younger African Americans who lived in Newark and New York City, with zoning ordinances that, like many in the country, may well have had a racial intent. Mahwah and surrounding towns prohibited the construction of housing that would be affordable to working class families. In Mahwah, for example, the minimum lot size for house construction was a full acre. Because many of the new African American workers were unable to find housing for sale near the Mahwah plant, they drove 60 to 70 miles each way or depended on carpools and lengthy bus rides. Some rented single small apartments in nearby towns, returning to their families on weekends. African American auto workers who commuted from distant urban neighborhoods incurred annual costs attributable to the travel of $1,000 to $1,500 each in 1970, or about 10% of their annual gross incomes. far more than if they had lived in Mahwah or its vicinity. The African American auto workers' incomes were also depressed because the excessive travel contributed to job losses when workers were fired for absenteeism that was partly attributable to transportation obstacles. Ford executives complained of high turnover, and later, when they closed the Mahwah plant and reopened it in Mexico, high absenteeism was a factor executives cited in explaining the decision. This was not a problem unique to workers in Mahwah. Nationwide, African Americans had disposable incomes that were lower than those of the whites with whom they worked, because of higher commuting costs from segregated neighborhoods to jobs that were now found in the suburbs. It is certainly true that one cause of segregation today is the inability of many African Americans to afford to live in middle-class communities. But segregation itself has had a high cost for African Americans, exacerbating their inability to save to purchase suburban homes. Income differences are only a superficial way to understand why we remain segregated. Racial policy in which government was inextricably involved created some income disparities that ensure residential segregation continuing to this day. Okay, so that's chapter 10. It started out and it talked about unions, how unions kept African Americans out, or if they let them in, they had auxiliaries and then didn't let them vote. And then it talked about how the government overseen these unions, and whenever the union would complain about African American workers, they'd just say, okay, you can not have them. Talked about World War II and how during the war they needed labor and they would still discriminate. Then they'd hire white women, then they had to hire black men, but they would make special rules. And then after the war, then they just fired everybody and started over with all white workforce. Then it got into getting the jobs in the first place. Then it got into the discriminatory property assessments, and how, and I never realized this. It doesn't surprise me, but I didn't know that African Americans were charged so much more for property tax. And how pernicious it is, because it's hard to know. You know your taxes are high, but you don't know what your neighbors, not your neighbors, but some other neighborhood with white people, you don't know how much they're paying. So you don't really know that you're paying more for less. And even if you're renting, you're still paying those taxes, because obviously the rent covers the taxes, so you got to pay higher rent. And then it got to that, how much higher people of color had to pay for property and rent. all of this he's pointing at is that African Americans were not only just redlined into certain areas, but that they had less money. They couldn't save money to buy houses because they had they had to pay more for housing, either through property taxes or higher rent and lower wages and greater transportation costs. All right. Pertaining to Rockford, I'm sure all of this is true in Rockford. I can't imagine that all of this stuff isn't true in Rockford. You know, it's big, and we're a big industrial hub. African Americans were redlined to the west side. They, I'm sure, paid higher property tax, higher rent, lower wages, lower job titles, kept out of unions. So yeah, that's chapter 10. I'm going to stop this live, and we'll kick it back up when somebody else is ready.